And thank you, Alexandra. Okay, so the recording is in progress. And look, I'd like to thank you all for um, coming along to listen tonight. Um, my apologies for the change in the normal time, but it's 9 o'clock at night in Australia, and if we'd waited another few hours, I would be asleep. So my apologies for that. But I hope you find, nevertheless, what I have to say interesting. Um, I grew up in Northwest Europe and was immersed in Celtic cultures. I moved to Australia about 10 years ago and have become immersed in um, Australian cultures to some extent. So I thought it would be very interesting to look at the two contrasting cultures and draw out a similar theme, which is about how what we often call myths or legends actually describe um, sea level rising across a coast and the effects which that had. So I want to just start by talking a little bit. I want to get the thing to move first. There we go. About how old some memories are. This is the Apennine Mountains in central Italy, and this is the famous meteorite crater um, that many of you may know. And in this area, about 412 AD, there was a lot of pagan beliefs. There were a lot of drunken orgies, bacchanalia, until the evening that a meteorite crashed to the earth with a resounding thump, whereupon all the people converted to Christianity and never really looked back. And even though this happened about 1600 years ago, it wasn't written down until about 140 years ago. So it was preserved as an oral tradition, a memory preserved as an oral tradition for almost 2000 years. Something similar in Argentina, of course, the meteorites of the Campo di Cielo, um, which happened probably about 4,000 years ago, and perhaps led people to start to venerate the sun. And a lot of my own research has been in the islands of Fiji in the Southwest Pacific. And this is the island of Kondavu, at the western end of which is Nambukelevu volcano. Um, and around 2,500 years ago, this volcano erupted, and people on an island called Ono, about 30 miles away, witnessed this eruption. And to this day, they tell stories about what it involved, stories passed on orally from one generation to the next. In this kind of context, this was an interview with Petero Uluinadeva in 2019 in association with my PhD student Loredana Lancini. Um, and the information that we got from these stories was so detailed that we were able to reconstruct details of this eruption that were unknown to geologists. So it demonstrated the power, if you like, of oral traditions. And then we moved to Crater Lake in the state of Oregon in the western United States. And Crater Lake formed 7,600 years ago as a result of the terminal eruption of Mount Mazama. Mount Mazama was a massive volcano, and one day it exploded and everything collapsed to form this caldera that Crater Lake came to fill. And there are Klamath stories that recall this event. And they are very clear that they are a recollection of this event that happened 7,600 years ago. And then if we move to Australia, these are the Wellesley Islands in the Gulf of Carpentaria. I'll talk about these again later, but basically they are a group of islands off the mainland coast of Australia. And the people of those islands have stories that talk about how these islands were once part of a peninsula running out from the mainland. And the last time that this was true was about 8,000 years ago. So, in summary, we ask the question, how long can stories of this kind last in pre-literate or oral contexts? So we have examples from Italy that are at least 1600 years old. We have examples from Fiji around 2500 years old. Traditions from the United States, from Oregon, about 7,600 years ago, and examples from Australia that are more than 8,000 years old. So for me, um, when I wrote my 2018 book, The Edge of Memory, this was really trying to explain that oral traditions in the right circumstances can last for thousands of years, which is quite a radical suggestion. What happened? Well, literacy changed everything. We today celebrate the ability to read and write, but that has come at a cost. And the cost is the loss of thousands of years of oral knowledge. Some of that oral knowledge remains, but of course, it's often misinterpreted. People talk about myths and legends as being exciting, made up stories that are products of the imagination, entertainments created by our ancestors, which really is very unlikely. So we judge our ancient ancestors who couldn't read and write as having survived by luck, as having little or no ability to combat uncertainty, and that's completely wrong. We have also repurposed art and poetry and dance and song, all of these things that I suggest began as pragmatic ways of communicating knowledge in oral societies. Our diminishment of all this I've called, in The Edge of Memory, I've called the arrogance of literacy. The idea that because we are literate, we tend to dismiss all knowledge that is not written down. So what I want to do today is to talk about four things. To talk about post-glacial sea level rise and its eyewitnesses. Then I want to focus on Australia. Then I want to focus on the Celtic coasts of Northwest Europe. And finally, ask questions about why were these memories preserved for so long? And do they in fact have any value to us today as we wrestle with the challenges of climate change and sea level rise once again? So the first part, and I should explain that I'm a geologist by background, so but I hope that this will be fairly easy to understand. So if we look at the last 150,000 years of Earth history, um, so within that period of time, the ocean's surface, the sea level has changed. It's gone up and down for reasons that we understand very well. So the blue line shows the changing sea level, the broken line shows present sea level, and it's from 150 years ago to today. 150 years on the left, 150,000 years on the left to today on the right. And it shows the sea level in feet or in meters, depending on which you prefer, on the scale, on the side. Most of this period covers what we call the last ice age or the last glacial period. The coldest time of the last ice age was about 22,000 to 18,000 years ago. And you can see that the ocean surface, the sea level, was at its lowest then, about 125, 130 meters. That's more than 400 feet lower than it is today. And of course, in many parts of the world, people were living. And what happened after that is very important. It's what we call post-glacial sea level rise. A very rapid, by comparison, a very rapid rise of sea level that caused or forced immense changes to human cultures that were based along the coastline, along the fringes of the land. The first modern humans in Australia arrived about 65, 70,000 years ago, somewhere in northern Australia. They crossed the Wallace Line from Ireland, Southeast Asia, or what is today Ireland, Southeast Asia, and reached northern Australia about 70,000 years or so ago. And it was very similar with modern humans, Homo sapiens in Europe. For example, in Grotte Mandrin in France, about 54,000 years ago, people arrived. So the point I'm making here is that there were people in most parts of the world before the coldest time of the last ice age. So they experienced a lower sea level, and they experienced this very rapid rise in the sea level after that. Here's the example of Australia. During the last ice age to today, Australia has lost about 23%, almost a quarter of its land area that existed then. And there were people in Australia at this time. So of course, there are stories. And we now have ancient stories of submergence from 34 places all the way around the coast of Australia. And Australia is the same size as Europe. If you look at Western Australia, places like Shark Bay, and you think of that as France or Ireland, then Brisbane is the equivalent of Turkey, and places like that. So Australia is the same size as Europe, and at 34 places now, all around the coast of Australia, we have stories from people who are living there, passed down orally across time, that recall the submergence of the coastline. And I'll talk about more of those in a minute. And in the same way, in Northwest Europe, we have, there's Ireland, Wales, England, France here as an example. We have ancient stories of submergence from many places there as well. And I will come back and talk about some of these later. So that's really just to set the scene. Let me now dive more closely into Australia. Here are the 34 ancient stories of submergence, and I'm going to give you examples from 5 different places. Firstly, from Kangaroo Island, which you can see, the red circle down there. Secondly, from the Bass Strait, which is between the island of Tasmania and mainland Australia. Thirdly, from Sydney, the largest city in Australia. Then from the Wellesley Islands that I mentioned already, up there in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And finally from Shark Bay in Western Australia. So I'm just giving you examples from these different places. Let's start with Kangaroo Island. That's Kangaroo Island in the distance there, viewed from mainland Australia. And they are separated by an area of water called Backstairs Passage. Backstairs Passage is about 40 kilometers wide. It's about 35 meters deep today. And here's a map. Mainland Australia is in the top right. Kangaroo Island is on the left in the west. And you can see Backstairs Passage between the two. There are stories from the local Garinderi people that talk about a tall and powerful man called Gurunderi, who had 2 wives who fled from him, crossing Backstairs Passage at the time by walking and wading, meaning that they were able to walk on dry land, but also through a little bit of water. Gurunderi became very angry when he saw this, and he summoned the waves to rise up and to drown his 2 wives. And their bodies were washed south and became the islands known today as the Pages. You can see them there on the map. And since this time, Backstairs Passage has been underwater. So I read a story like that, And I think this is a memory of the submergence of Backstairs Passage. What else could it be? Did people invent stories like this? Why would they? Um, and we've done more research there since that time, and we found that the land bridge between the two was last submerged just over 10,000 years ago. So the earliest stories date from just over 10,000 years ago. And we published this last year in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. The second example from Australia is of Bass Strait. And what you see in the top of the map here is mainland Australia, and in the south of the map is Tasmania. And the last land bridge connecting the two, you can see represented there by the red line, and the calculations are there in the box. There are stories from Tasmania, from the people, the indigenous people of Tasmania, that talk about the island being settled by people from a far country. They came on land and the sea was subsequently formed. These are the Palawa people, and they talk about icebergs. They talk about icebergs melting and causing the ocean surface to rise and to drown the land bridge. And what's amazing about these stories is that they appear to be around 12,500 years old. There's really no alternative for that. We can calculate today very precisely when the land bridge was underwater or went underwater. And this is about 12,500 years old. So these memories have endured for at least that time, probably because of their importance to environmental risk management. And what I mean by that is that people remembered these stories in case things like this happened again. They wanted to understand the risks involved in living in a particular place. And this again was published fairly recently in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2023. The third example is from Sydney. And most people who visit Australia fly into Sydney Airport. Here's the centre of Sydney. Sydney Airport is in Botany Bay. You can see it sticking out there. And Botany Bay is also remembered as the place where Captain James Cook first arrived in Australia to claim it for Great Britain. Just south of Botany Bay is a place called Bait Bay, and I want to talk briefly about the two. If we look first at Botany Bay, a long time ago, the Dharawal people were living in what's today Botany Bay, and it was all swampy land. It was a fine place to live. But one day the people went into the hills to thank the god for this. And when they came back, they found instead of the swamps, there was a great bay filled with water. And this to me is a memory of a time when Botany Bay changed from being marsh when the sea level was lower to being a bay filled with water as a result of sea level rise. And if that oral tradition is accurate, then it requires sea level to be around 9 meters lower, which has last occurred about 8,000 years ago. Just next to Botany Bay is Bait Bay, and you can see a picture there. And there are stories from the Aboriginal people of Australia that talk about how in Bait Bay the land used to be much further out to sea than it is today. And people used to collect ochre from a site right out there. And again, if that story is accurate, then it recalls a time over 7,000 years ago when the ocean surface was at least 5 meters lower than it is today. The fourth example is one I talked about in my introduction, which is from the Wellesley Islands in Queensland in Northern Australia. And it talks about how Aboriginal stories talk about how these islands were once part of a peninsula running out from the mainland. So all of this area that you can see there was once joined to the mainland. And our people say that the channels were caused by Gangur, a sea gull woman who dragged a big raft back and forth across the peninsula and cut it and made islands where before there were no islands. And my final example is from Shark Bay in Western Australia. And these stories are thanks to Bianca McNear. And they talk about how in the past in Shark Bay, the tides were much further out than they are today. And there were many freshwater camps that are now underwater. And they say old people were giant, tall people. They would walk long distances through the tides, and they walked from what is today Dirk Hartog Island to what is today Denham. You can see the red line there, and that's a distance of more than 20 kilometers. Um, and it's very interesting because if you look at Shark Bay from the air, you can see these biridas, they're natural salt pans. But to the Aboriginal people of Shark Bay, these are the footprints of the giants who came in the past and walked from one landmass to another. So again, these stories tell me that people in Shark Bay have a memory of when these two land masses were connected, and people did in fact walk between these land masses. They weren't giant, they were just normal. But because the sea level has risen and created a gap that's 20 meters, 20 kilometers wide, the stories have to now involve giants who could walk across such ocean gaps. It's possible to put ages on these kinds of stories by understanding the history of sea level change around Australia in this case. And this graph shows how the ocean surface, sea level, changed within the last 13,000 years or so around Australia. And I don't want to go into great details, but about 13,000 years ago, the ocean surface was about 70 meters below what it is today. So you can reconstruct by looking at the story what you think the sea level would have been at a particular time, um, and put an age on it. So doing that sort of thing, we can say the stories from Shark Bay are more than 7,000 years old, perhaps more than 9,000 years old. For the Wellesley Islands and the Sydney stories, again, almost 7,500 years old, at least. For Kangaroo Island, more than 10,000. For Bass Strait, closer to 12,000. If there was only one story from Australia and we did this kind of thing, we might dismiss it as an anomaly. But because we now have groups of stories from 34 distinct places all the way around Australia, I suggest that what we're doing here is in fact capturing authentic memories from the deep past. I want now to do the same thing in part 3 for Northwest Europe. And in Northwest Europe, I'm going to give you, I think, 5 examples again. First of all, Loch Tudi and Ile Glenon in Brittany. There you are, down there, the little red circle. And then the stories about Ys, mostly from Bay de Douarnenez in Brittany, but many people place Ys in other places. And then from Lyonesse, the stories from the Scilly Isles and Cornwall in the southwest part of England. And then stories that I've been working on recently from the Isle of Man, the largest island in the Irish Sea. And then finally stories from the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, from the Monarch and the Northwest Islands of the Outer Hebrides there. So I'll talk about each of these 5 places in turn. First of all, then, the Île Glénon in France. These are, here's a map of the area. You can see the Île Glénon, the islands of the Glénon archipelago down there in the south. They include Île aux Moutons, the sheep island there. And you can see where Loch Tudi and Becmel are. There are stories from both, from throughout this area about how these islands were once connected to Loch Tudi and Becmel. These are translations into English. My apologies for not giving you the original French. But in 1877, Élisée Reclus noted that these islands continued the old coast. They talk about how the islands of Glénon were once a sizable island and that people would have witnessed the destruction of this island. More details were given by Paul Sébillot in 1905. The memory of the time when this archipelago was joined to the continent has not been forgotten. And they talk about how it was once possible to travel on foot from places like Becmel to Île aux Moutons, and a church procession that used to go from Loch Tudi out to one of the islands, following an alley of large trees like that. So, you know, 100 years and more ago, these traditions were alive in this part of Brittany. And it's possible that these are, in fact, 10,000-year-old memories of what I call thin places. So places which were once quite wide, and then gradually over time, they became thinner and thinner and thinner. And the people who utilized them or who lived there became more and more anxious until eventually the place disappeared altogether. The second example from the Celtic coasts of Northwest Europe is the Bay de Douarnenez in France. And this is a beautiful photograph showing the bay in all its glory. The coast of Brittany, particularly this western Brittany, shows many signs of long-term submergence, which we know results from sea level rise. And this is based on the work of Pierre Stéphane and his colleagues, but just basically showing the same rise in the ocean surface right up to the present day. What is different between Brittany and Australia is that in Brittany, the ocean surface, the sea level, has been rising almost continuously since the coldest time of the last ice age. And in Australia, that didn't happen. Sea level rose until about 7,000 years ago, and then effectively it was stable. We understand the reasons. I don't want to go into them now, but there are different records of sea level change in different parts of the world. And these differences must be factored in when we are interpreting ancient stories of these kinds. Yes, based on the work of Axel Krejci and again his colleagues, I've worked a lot with people in universities throughout Brittany over the last 10 years or so. Anyway, Is. This is the Bay de Douarnenez in the distance, the Bay de Trépassé closer to us here. And stories of Is are most commonly associated with a princess, Dahu, and King Gradlon, le roi Gradlon, who you can see here with Is in the background. And the story is that Is was a city that was surrounded by high walls to keep the ocean out. And at high tide, all the gates had to be closed. But Dahu became entranced, if you like, and one night at high tide, she opened the gates, the water flooded into the city, and everyone had to flee, including them. And the memories of these stories are preserved throughout this part of Brittany. And they have been preserved for a long time. This again is another quotation right up until the time of the Great Revolution in 1789. The clergy of the different riverside passages went every year out into the Bay de Douarnenez to say mass over the drowned city. And since this time, the custom has been lost. But when the sea is calm, you can see the remains of the great city beneath the ocean surface. So this was a story, maybe 300, 400, 500 years old. And many of these stories are associated with Landévennec, the abbey there, the old abbey, with religious processions and with the beach at Pentré. The third example I want to give from the Celtic coasts of Northwest Europe is the example of Lyonesse and um, most of the stories appear to originate in the Scilly Isles, which are off the southwest tip of England, off the tip of Cornwall, and this is what they look like today. And this is written in Old English, and I apologize for that. But in times gone by, people said that the Scilly Isles were linked to Cornwall. There was a land bridge, but by the violence of the raging seas and the process of time, the land between them was wasted and devoured. And sometimes you can look beneath the ocean surface and see monuments of houses and churches below the water. This from 1793. And more recent work by myself and Rita Compantangelo Susignon from the University of Le Mans, we published it in Folklife last year. It suggests that the Lyonesse stories originated in the Scilly Isles about 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. I won't go into great detail here, but you can look at the original study. It's freely available if you wish. The fourth example comes from the Isle of Man, the largest island in the Irish Sea. And there are several different oral traditions from different places in the Isle of Man. The Calf of Man, for example, is the island to which, or there's an island near the Calf of Man to which the creator spirit, MacAnnan, was exiled, and every 7 years that island reappears and then sinks again. Derby, in the northwest part of the Isle of Man, is where giants once fought and swam to nearby Scotland. And the point of Ayr up there was once just a stone's throw away from the Scottish coast. Today it's about 40 kilometers away. And we have more in Castleton Bay. Sailors sometimes see through the deep, clear waters and hear the bleating of sheep and the barking of dogs and the muffled chiming of bells. Of course, these sounds cannot be heard, but they are a way of preserving memories of land submergence in oral cultures. And then Port Soderick again, where an enchanted island appears every 7 years or so. And reconstructions show that the Isle of Man was last connected to the English mainland about 9,000 years ago, somewhere off the coast of Ramsey. Excuse me. And then my final example comes from the Outer Hebrides of Scotland and looks specifically at the red circle there between the Monarch Islands and the North Uist mainland. And oral traditions collected by Alexander Carmichael in the 1860s. He was a tax collector, but he had a passion for collecting stories that he considered to be endangered. So when he went to the Monarch Islands, he spent a lot of time talking to the people who lived there and collected stories that recall when the Monarch Islands were once connected to the North Uist mainland. Today you can see it's about 20 kilometers distance. The land bridge, or the isthmus, was called Aioi, as many places still are. And he talks about, or the stories talk about, how the isthmus, the thin place, gradually disappeared. And it mentions in these traditions the names of the people who last crossed between the two land masses, and the names of the people who drowned in trying to cross. So this kind of geographical change is very much embedded in human history in these parts of the world. Another example comes from the Isles of Baya and Kirkibost, just there off the coast of North Uist. Bailshire means East Village in Gaelic, and maybe there was a West Village that's now submerged, and so on and so on. And in 1845, a great part of Kirkibost was literally blown away, and the sea occupied fields which once bore excellent crops. And the point here is that there seems to be an ongoing trend of submerging these islands that is recalled in recent traditions, but also inferred from much more ancient traditions. And just have a quick look at the islands there of Berneray and Pabay. In 1935, the ecologist Charles Elton undertook extensive research on these islands, and heard a story told personally to him by 3 different men of an interesting and deeply grounded tradition that in former times these 2 islands were separated by such a narrow channel that people could shout across or even throw things across if they wished. And today you can see that the gap is much wider. So these kinds of stories are common throughout the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. It's now 3.5 kilometers between the two. So doing the same thing that I did for Australian stories, the minimum age from the story, or for the stories from Loch Tudi and Il Glennon, is probably about 8,400 years ago. In the Bay de Douarnenez, 8,390 years ago seems to be the minimum age. Lyonesse stories are probably younger, likely to have originated 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. Isle of Man, over 8,000 years ago, and the Outer Hebrides stories certainly over 7,000 years ago. So you will immediately see that the stories from the Celtic coasts of Northwest Europe are similar in age to the stories from Aboriginal Australia. So I suggest that this perhaps represents something like the edge of memory, how in optimal conditions, stories can survive in oral contexts for 7, 8, 9,000 years, maybe even longer. So the last part of my talk is, why were submergence memories preserved for so long, and do they have any value today? Why were submergence memories preserved for so long? Memories of catastrophic or life-impacting events were preserved in oral cultures as a form of risk management. And this is something that Loredana Lancini, who's online today, has done a lot of very interesting work on. People didn't remember stories of this kind just for their amusement. They had practical reasons for doing so, and it was to inform their risk management view of the world. If you wanted your children and their children and their children to survive, then you had to explain the risks involved in living in a particular place. And that's what these stories are. And that's what tells us, I think, that pre-literate societies were as risk-averse and risk-aware as we are today. Today, we often think because we can read and write that we have a much better understanding of place-based risk. but I don't believe we do. And much can be learned from treating these stories as possible fact rather than fiction. And mermaid stories may be vehicles for remembering the submergence of inhabited lands. And do these ancient submergence memories have any contemporary value? Are they of any use to us today? Well, they do. I teach my students about climate change, and one of the things I talk about is that these stories tell us that climate change is not affecting humanity for the first time today, that our ancestors in the past were also affected by climate change, by rising sea level, by changing geographies over which they had no control. This, of course, is not a reason to trivialize climate change or the challenges that it poses for us in the future, but it does, I think, give some sense of comfort that climate change is not novel, as many people think it is. And here, of course, is King Canute, more than 1,000 years ago, trying to stop the waves from encroaching on the land. And that also, this picture also shows us, the story that shows us that these kinds of situations caused considerable anxiety in the past. Canute was trying to explain to his people that nobody had control over the sea, that people had to adapt to rising sea levels. And similar things happen today. This is the foreign minister of Tuvalu in November 2021. Again, trying to explain to the world that the people of his low-lying country are understandably anxious about sea level rise. So, my last slide, further reading. The work that Rita and I have done was published in Folk Life in 2024. There's a paper in World Archaeology that covers a lot of these things, and a paper with several colleagues from Northwest Europe published in Quaternary International in 2022. And recent work on Australian traditions, published in this book here, Indigenous Knowledge. The other 3 books are mine, and you're more than welcome to dig into them. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It was amazing.
Yes, I agree. Fantastic.